let's talk about your old mates in the Labor Party, because they're all over the shop when it comes to climate change. So 2015, they signed up to 45% emissions reduction because it was a way of standing out from the Liberals at the time. They doubled down on that in at the 2016 campaign, 2019 campaign, where the cost of inaction was apparently a better explanation.
The uncosted cost of inaction.
The cost of transition. Well, Albo, of course, has walked away from that, but the rhetoric hasn't changed because, remember, Each Way Albo, as I'm going to call him all this year, Each Way Albo, is still playing the each way game, and his shadow ministers are too. Remember, every word you're about to hear comes from a team whose captain has said they're not doing 45% emissions anymore. They're going to stretch it out to 2050.
There's no doubt in my mind that if you don't have a policy on climate change, if you don't make the long-term investments in infrastructure, then it's not a matter of if, but when it happens again.
In recent days, businesses, investors, economists, central banks, respected institutions like the IMF and the Labor Party have all shown that they understand something that Scott Morrison does not. And that is that climate change is a real risk to the economy and to financial security.
Our focus as the opposition for the next 2.5 years is to do all we can to hold Scott Morrison to account, to keep him to his commitment to stick to that 26 to 28% reduction.
So remember, it's a climate emergency, but when it comes to, again, Each Way Albo, well, this is him having that bet each way.
On climate change, for example, one of the things that we're likely to do is to announce a longer-term target before we announce, because by definition,
2050,
you're able
zero
to
net
do
emissions.
That.
2050.
Well, we'll wait and we'll make our announcements at an appropriate time. Frankly, I think it was a mistake in 2019 to continue to say, well, we'll do exactly what we're doing in 2015, as if it hadn't changed.
Now, I know they're not the government, Mark, but whatever the post-election moment, if Labor was supposedly going to learn its lesson about cost of transition is what Australians have the issue with, not the existence of and need to deal with, largely. But then he's pushing away from 45 while being the each way bet, trying to pretend that the joint's burning.
Yeah, well, you'll see a lot more of this from Albanese, because what we do know about him is that if he told the Australian people what he truly believes in, all the issues where he's been on the wrong side of the debate for 30 years, all these radical inner-city left-wing causes that Albanese has championed, if he told them what he really believes in, Labor would end up with 10 seats.
Yeah.
So he can't do that. He can't do that. So you'll find all this sort of sophistry and trickery to hide their real intentions. On climate change, it'll be a 2050 target rather than a 2030 target, because Albanese knows, as Joel Fitzgibbon knows there from the seat of Hunter, that these policies are job destroyers. You can't have it both ways. You can't have climate change policy and an economic nirvana. You're going to have destruction of jobs. In the Hunter Valley, 75,000 jobs rely on coal. And you just can't wipe those out and make working class communities welfare sinkholes without devastating social consequences. So, you know, Labor's trapped between what would be a real social justice agenda, that's jobs, jobs and more jobs, and its belief in climate change, so they're going to try and just hide it as best they can going into the next election.
But also, Rita, simultaneously, they try to run state campaigns at federal levels and federal ones at state levels because, they love blurring the lines there, as well, they're pretty good at doing. Remember, cuts to hospitals and all the rest of it here. Well, if the climate change activists win, they get rid of coal tomorrow. In a place like New South Wales, that's $1.9 billion to the state budget. That means a cut somewhere to health, to police, to emergency services, to all of those things that they supposedly champion. So I say it's not just the each way bet from Albo, but they are an absolute mess. And isn't it interesting? Could you imagine if Scott Morrison had decided that he was going to push out 2030 targets to 2050? The think pieces would be coming out of the yin-yang. Instead, the left barely tweet about this bloke making a rather significant change.
Well, no, and of course the facts and figures don't come into it, because you're talking about a religion here, and little things like jobs and economic prosperity and people's livelihoods. You can't even bring those up, because then you're a denier and you're going to end up in the climate courts. They're talking about actually running these courts where deniers are held responsible for their crimes against humanity. These people are full-blown nuts, many of them. I mean, some of the nonsense that I have seen online from not just random anonymous trolls, but people who've put their name to it, people who have got a profile, people who work within the media, is just astonishing. And that's why they couldn't even cost their policies at the last election. They could not tell us what would be the financial cost, the economic cost of their policies. They just gave these answers about, well, you know, the cost of doing nothing is even greater. Well, that's not an answer. If you've got a policy, put a dollar sign next to it. And what about Chalmers there? He's supposed to be one of their best and brightest, and he's talking about respected institutions like the IMF and the Australian Labor Party. I mean, these people are lost. Yes, they're having a bit of a bump at the moment because the media has just been so utterly, overwhelmingly vicious with the coalition, particularly Scott Morrison, but they don't stand up to any level of scrutiny, and that's their problem. They're not going to be able to answer the hard questions.
Corey, do you believe the preferred Prime Minister in Australia right now is Ichwe Albo?
I find that hard to believe, but we know how misleading the polls can be, Paul. But you know, the question I want to ask these people is if Australia had enacted Kevin Rudd's carbon pollution reduction scheme, or whatever it was called at the time, or an emissions trading scheme, would these fires have been any different? Would the climate be any different at all if we'd spent the last decade taxing ourselves into poverty? And the answer to that, of course, is no, because the cause of this catastrophe is generally man-made. Man's inaction, not on climate change, but on clearing forests, on preparing the infrastructure and having the personnel, fostering the volunteer spirit. And over the Christmas period, I saw Tony Abbott out there fighting fires. And you remember, the same media who were following him fighting those fires were the ones that pilloried him for being a volunteer, for volunteering on as a surf lifesaver, as a firefighter. Get back to your day job, they would say. It's appalling. And these lefties are hoist on their own petard.
Well, remember when, of course, Tony Abbott got a Long Service Medal from the RFS on International Women's Day, and that was a great outrage because the Prime Minister. We remember this stuff. They think that we're goldfish like them. We're not.